Thank you very much for joining me today for this presentation. My name is Earl Toler. I am participating in the MBE 400 class with Professor Halpern. This will be an oral report covering real-life ethical dilemma questions from the book, and the topic today will be the Bhopal disaster that occurred in India in 1984. Before we can address the ethical dilemmas surrounding this situation, we need to gain a better understanding of what happened in Bhopal. On December 3rd, 1984, about 45 tons of a dangerous gas called methyl isocyanate escaped from an insecticide plant that was owned by the Indian subsidiary of the American firm Union Carbide Corporation. The gas drifted over the densely populated neighborhoods around the plant, killing thousands of people immediately, and created a panic as tens of thousands of others attempted to flee Bhopal. The final death toll was estimated to be somewhere between 15 and 20,000. Some 500,000 survivors suffered respiratory problems, eye irritation or blindness, and other maladies resulting from the exposure to the toxic gas. Many were awarded compensation of a few $100s. Investigations later established that substandard operating and safety procedures at the understaffed plant had led to the disaster. In 1998, the former factory site was turned over to the state of Madhya Pradesh. And then the facility was later sold to the Dow Chemical Corporation, which we talk about later in the presentation. 3,800 people were killed almost immediately. The issue was known and preventable. There was a report issued by the Union Carbide safety team around 3 months ahead of this incident. Union Carbide owned 2 of these pesticide plants. The sister plant was located in Institute, West Virginia. The corrective actions related to the methyl isocyanate storage area and the maintenance and things that needed to happen there. Those things were not even shared with the Indian team, but the corrective actions took place in Institute, West Virginia, which ultimately probably prevented an incident like this. But they didn't share this with the Indian team. And then at the onset of the incident, the Union Carbide team essentially tried to blame employee sabotage in the Indian plant for the issue. But the reality was they weren't taking care of the maintenance required on the storage tanks for such a volatile process, and you could get things like water intrusion in those tanks, and a small amount of water would create a violent runaway reaction that would cause an explosion and then scatter this stuff all over the place, which is exactly what happened. The CEO, Warren Anderson, he never was held. They never were able to hold him accountable. There was a $470 million settlement, but the spill was never cleaned up. So moving forward, we'll take some time to evaluate some ethical dilemmas surrounding this situation, and take a deep dive into sort of what happened and look at the response. All right, so the book presents ethical dilemma number 1 as why has the United States government not extradited former Union Carbide chairman Warren Anderson to face his charges in India? Warren Anderson was arrested in Mumbai in 1984, right after this incident occurred. However, the Indian officials that detained Warren Anderson left him in a cell that still contained a landline phone. So Warren, being a very smart individual, uses that landline to contact some of his folks either in the United States or some assets that were already there in India, and they helped him escape. Warren was then sort of smuggled to the United States somehow, where he lived out the rest of his life relatively comfortably. One of the excerpts I read said that he would often complain about not being able to go out to dinner in the United States and socialize and go to these big events because he worried that he would be process served. For years he had that fear. However, Washington was incredibly unresponsive to India's multiple requests. I believe there were somewhere near 60 requests to extradite Warren Anderson in the years leading up to his death. Unfortunately, he dies in September 28th in 2014 in Vero Beach, Florida. I believe that was his second home that he spent a lot of time at. But ultimately, Warren really never realized any of the um, repercussions that were really probably due to him, and the restitution that really should have been paid to the families in India that lived through this event, or that died because of this event. They never received proper restitution. And Union Carbide ultimately sold the facility back to the government in India, who later sold it to the Dow Chemical Corporation. Ethical dilemma number two presents the idea of how would Union Carbide's reaction to the gas leak have been different if the plant had been located in the United States? Which is an interesting question because Union Carbide only had two of these facilities that manufactured methyl isocyanate. Methyl isocyanate is an intermediate chemical that is used in the production of pesticides. So clearly very toxic, a high level of safety and inspection, preventative maintenance needs to take place in a facility of this kind. And it's very clear that this wasn't being done in India. However, the Union Carbide safety team, internal safety team, warned the business of safety issues 3 months before this event. The report showed that a runaway reaction could occur, and so if you remember back to the video, there are things where you could have condensation or a thin layer of water in the tank, which would create an adverse reaction and an explosion, which would then scatter this very toxic methyl isocyanate up into the air, to be respiratory, to be um, sort of on the skin, in waterways, in the dirt, in the ground, really contaminating the environment. And from the videos that I've seen, the Indian government and the company facility itself really didn't have adequate resources or medical response teams to be able to even come remotely close to trying to, respond to an event of this nature. Interesting fact is that they did take the corrective action, and start doing the preventative maintenance and the things that were required to prevent this in Institute, West Virginia at the alternate facility. However, the information was not even shared with the Indian team and no action was taken. In the months following the incident investigation, so to speak, the Union Carbide officials essentially blamed employee sabotage at the plant as the root cause for the incident, completely absolving themselves of any responsibility. I believe that the information related to the safety issues being told ahead of time wasn't found out for quite some time later. All of that information did come out in legal proceedings that took place in India, and the company was found guilty. There were some very low sort of fines paid, and a few individuals that they sought for jail time. But the Indian government was completely unsuccessful in trying to achieve any real repercussions and inflicting them on to these folks that were, in the leadership team of Union Carbide at the time. So essentially, they got away with this. They did pay, I think, 470 million in punitive damages, which didn't even begin to come close to covering the needs of the families. Ethical dilemma number three is, do you think a payment of $550 is fair for the victims of the disaster? What do you think the payment would be if the disaster occurred in the United States? So one of the things I wanted to take a look at first was, what is the value of $550 in 1984 versus 2023? So when we look at inflation and such, $550 in 84 equals $1,611.43 in 2023. So in my opinion, at a very high level, there's no way that that is adequate payment for a family that goes through, an incident like this. $1,600 will barely cover most people's rent for 1 month, and that's kind of regardless of what country you're in, especially a Western country. Um, in Western countries and other liberal democracies, however, estimates for the value of a statistical life typically range from anywhere from $1 million to $10 million. An example is that FEMA has established the value of a statistical life in the United States at around $7.5 million in 2020. So that would be the expectation of a U.S. family member if there was some sort of corporate disaster that took a life of their family member. They would be looking for compensation in the range of $1 to $10 million, not 1,600 U.S. dollars. Um, the average payout for a hurricane victim from FEMA in the U.S. has been around $3,000 for the last 10 years. So based on that information, I think that any payout for a victim of this type of event in the United States is going to be significantly higher than it would be in a second or third world country where they're operating. The reason that they're likely operating in that country is due to less stringent safety requirements, lower pay expectations, lower quality of life, lower regard for the cost of life or for the value of life. And I think that that's a strategic decision that's made by the corporation long before they ever build a plant there. I think that speaks greatly to, what their likely anticipated response is going to be if they do have an event that they have to remediate in a country like that. Ethical dilemma number four is compare the U.S. government's response to the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster with its response to the Union Carbide disaster. We can make a comparison. However, I don't think there is much of a comparison in the sense of the action that was taken for BP Deepwater Horizon was immense. It was scathing. It was quick. It was punitive. And British Petroleum paid a dear price, or a very large, very costly price for not only the environmental damage that they did, but also the impact it had on fisheries and families that lived along the coastline, and just the ecological impact that this had. They were, the U.S. government really held BP's feet to the fire here, and the U.S. government really allowed Union Carbide to get away with murder. So I don't think there's much of a comparison. I did find some interesting excerpts from a Time article where, they're essentially saying that Indians point at the way the U.S. government is now confronting the BP issue, holding it squarely responsible for the oil spill and accountable for all cleanup costs, as a stark contrast to the way that their own government has dealt with Union Carbide. The hope in India is that U.S. courts will be amenable rather, to the requests of Bhopal's victims now that America has a huge environmental disaster in its own backyard. The U.S. government must follow the same standards on corporate liability for U.S. corporations operating in India as it expects for corporations operating in the United States. And I think that that's a very adequate, appropriate expectation. I think it's a little bit ridiculous that the United States government would, turn a blind eye to something so scathingly terrible. Understanding that different countries have different regulations, I think it is fair, in an attempt to play devil's advocate, that India also needs to step the game up, right? India needs to present these corporations with higher expectations to operate in their country. They need to hold these people accountable to stringent safety requirements, OSHA type regulations, all the things that we have here in the United States. I think it's important for them to recognize their liability in this as well, right? From a social perspective, they have created an environment that harbors these types of corporations and encourages them to come do business there, knowing that they're not operating at the highest level of safety and scrutiny, and then after the fact want to try to hold their feet to the fire. So I hope that the Indian government has learned a valuable lesson from this incident. I think it's terribly unfortunate that they've had to experience this, and some 30 years later, there really has still been no, proper remediation. There are still children, swimming in the sludge pools and, dealing with the ramifications in their society still today, because no cleanup ever occurred. The government hasn't been able to hold Dow Chemical, the new owner of the facility, responsible for the cleanup either. And so the incident is still there. They're still living with this on a day-to-day basis. And I can't really see a bigger tragedy than that. So this was a very interesting thing to evaluate. I actually wasn't aware of this Bhopal incident previous to reading or doing this ethical dilemma oral report. So I'm appreciative of the opportunity to take a look into it. And I will definitely, this will be on the forefront of my mind when I hear about or I think about these types of incidents in the future. And as someone who works in the water purification chemical manufacturing industry for a large environmental services company, I think it's incredibly important that we learn from the past and that we leverage the very best safety technology and safety principles and apply those around the world to be able to keep people safe. I mean, it's important that we are able to manufacture and provide goods and services for the world. But we need to do that in a way that people are properly compensated. People go home with all their parts and pieces and can enjoy their family and come back to work the next day to do it again. And whatever the cost is required to do that, that cost needs to be inflicted upon that corporation. So thank you for your time. I appreciate you letting me present this little anecdote from history and listening to my kind of quick evaluation and thoughts. So have a great day, and thanks again for joining.